Fantastic, and we're only through one day. As we talked about yesterday, doing comparisons and hierarchical structure is not a good thing, so I'm not going to say today will be better than yesterday because we're in a judgment-free zone here. I do promise it will be engaging and enlightening and exciting, and it's because of Dan's work, but also because of you, the audience, so I'll please pump up on coffee. Let's have some great questions to fire at the panel later. We're going to start with Stephen Bell, but I'm going to turn things over to Dan Richter for the formal introduction. So again, thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Jamie. I'll be very brief. Anybody need a handout of today's events? Very good. We're going to follow the same structure as yesterday, with one exception, and that is I'll fade away and introduce Matt Booker, who will do the little ceremonies at the end. But I do want us to follow a similar structure where after the two talks, there are 15-minute breaks between the two talks. Each one will get full 45 minutes, but then we'll put 5 chairs in the front and try to stimulate a little discussion amongst the Humboldtian scholars who have dedicated so much of their lives to the work of this interesting person, and then we'll open it up for discussion like we did yesterday to the broader audience, and apparently even electronically connected to the world. In any event, first of the two Stevens is Stephen Bell, who has flown all the way across the country and denies that it was any effort at all. And then he stood in the cold yesterday and denied that had anything to do with the reality. So in any event, Stephen, full 45 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
So clearly, a person of denial. I want to talk today about Aimé Bonpland as much as Humboldt, mainly because I've devoted way more time to studying Bonpland than Humboldt. This is a complicated scientific relationship, a long one, and can't cover every element of it in one talk. But my theme is sort of cooperation and points of friction in a scientific partnership. Bonpland is perhaps not particularly well known. If anybody has read my book, they'll learn more about his very multi-layered career in southern South America. He was somebody who left Europe in late 1816, recruited by South American revolutionaries, a friend of people like Bolivar, of Bernardino Rivadavia, was recruited to the Rio de la Plata, to Buenos Aires, and his life doesn't really unfold in a conventional way according to expectation. The chair in medicine and natural history at the newly founded University of Buenos Aires never amounted to anything practical for Bonpland. He had to make a living, tried to do that in various ways, practicing medicine. He was an experimentalist in terms of economic development in South America, spent a lot of time traveling around making field observations in parts of Argentina, Uruguay, spent 10 years under house arrest in Paraguay, which is an interesting story in its own right. He also had a Brazilian component to his South American career and spent a fair amount of time in southernmost Brazil in the little town of São Borja, where the population was predominantly indigenous rather than Euro-American. So I'm going to talk about Humboldt and Bonpland, or Bonpland and Humboldt, after Bonpland left Europe in late 1816, and I'll probably end up focusing most on the post-Paraguayan period of this. This is based on predominantly the study of the correspondence exchange between the two of them, not just the actual letters sent sometimes, but where Bonpland is concerned, the drafts of letters, which I think are very revealing indeed, the sort of pre-edited reactions. So this journey course we've heard about, 1799 to 1804, it was of immense significance in encouraging others to travel to South America. In his influential discussion promoting the geographical nature of the concept of tropicality, David Arnold identifies Humboldt as the key figure for the development of an affirmative view of the tropics. Humboldt, he says, surely did more than any other individual to invent the tropics as a field of scientific inquiry and an aesthetic domain, and to feed a positive perception of the tropics into wider environmental debates. Researchers today do not always remember that the greater bulk of the botanical manuscripts written along the journey are Bonpland's work, nor sometimes even of his presence along the very journey. Walter Lack at Berlin has noted that while Humboldt's diaries from the journey have become a focus of research attention along the last decade or so, Bonpland's records have gone virtually unnoticed. Comparisons of the field notes with the botanical publications that eventually resulted along the ensuing decades after 1804 underline the central role the field notes played in the whole project. The exact division of labor in the field hardly seems important in what was an exemplary collaboration, a point that was emphasized this summer at the Humboldt-Bonpland Conference in Paraguay by Fred Stauffer from Geneva, from the herbarium there, emphasized again and again just how credit-worthy the working relationship surrounding botany between Bonpland and Humboldt was in the American journey between 1799 and 1804. Just who did what is something that people are still trying to determine, but the more significant point is that Bonpland, through his field work, had built up an immense capital as an explorer in his own right. It was capital he would eventually spend down to a large degree by choosing to work in a scientific periphery. While Humboldt's career stands for some as a triadic chord in the history of exploration, with preparation, journey, and analysis for publication in perfect harmony, our standard impression of Bonpland is one of disharmony, an idea stemming mainly from his limited publication record. These contrasting careers offer a particularly poignant illustration of the notion that 19th century geography was marked by growing tension between field work and the world of the study or laboratory. Geographers and historians of science have of late paid increasing attention to the cultures of exploration, mining with success some of the ambiguities of space. At base, much of this discussion hinges around the implications of location for the production and consumption of knowledge. Dorinda Outram has also written interestingly on this tension in her consideration of the different roles of space in natural history. The increase in experimental knowledge drawn from the study or laboratory increasingly called into question the value of information drawn from the field. In natural history, there was an increasing struggle over the value of field history. Botany began to pay greatly increased attention to internal structures, helped by the rise of microscopy, and not merely the external characteristics of plants. In analysis of the growing tension between field work and study, the experiences of Humboldt and Bonpland in the Americas were of key importance. A comment made in 1807 by Georges Cuvier, the famous student of comparative anatomy at Paris, pointed to an increasing struggle about the value of field research. Cuvier said, "The traveler can only travel one road. It is only really in one's study that one can roam freely throughout the universe." The work that inspired these reflections on Cuvier's part was none other than Humboldt's Tableau de la Nature. As Felix Driver has expressed it, arguments over the relation between observation in the field and theorizing in the study were to remain a chronic feature of the 19th century culture of exploration. Bonpland provides an example of a natural historian heavily implicated in the value of field work, whose findings on the social and economic significance of plants were close in style to the modern field of ethnobotany. The main theme of this paper I'm presenting today is the vulnerability of travelers who opted to work beyond the core networks of metropolitan science. Bonpland is a very important figure here because his career and especially his relationship to Humboldt, lie at the heart of the field theory nexus. The lives diverged. Bonpland's increasing commitment to a region, South America, and steadfast commitment to ongoing field work stood in contrast to Humboldt, who embraced the cosmopolitan world of scholarship. The geographer David Livingstone has written of the powerful visceral impact of the tropics on Humboldt. It was even more powerful in Bonpland's case. After 1821, he spent most of his remaining life embracing the challenges of working in subtropical parts of southern South America. Dorinda Outram has described Humboldt as a dominant and heroic figure in terms of the public veneration of his field history. Bonpland started out his professional career associated with some of these Humboldtian heroics, but his subsequent career points much more to the vulnerabilities of scientific travel. We also want to try to draw out the consequences of interrupted lines of communication, showing the importance of these interrupted lines of communication for the development of misunderstandings between the field worker and metropolitan science. All of this has had consequences for Bonpland's biography in the history of science. I then have a section on the stresses of quitting Europe, of Bonpland's sort of incipient life in the Americas, all sorts of idealistic projects that don't work out in the main because of political instability. He was drawing initially in South America a French state pension of 3,000 francs a year, given in consideration of the botanical materials that Humboldt donated to the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. That financial subsidy never was paid with any regularity in South America on account of interrupted residence patterns where Bonpland was not able to present the necessary paperwork easily done while he was resident in places like Buenos Aires on the Atlantic coast, not at all easy to do if you were a prisoner in Paraguay, for instance. And given the slowness of the hope of developing any kind of regular scientific life at Buenos Aires, he, disillusioned by the slowness of his projects, in October 1820, headed from the South American core into the periphery, and in a certain sense, never made it back to the South American core after 1820, except on occasions of several months at a time, which would then give him the chance to sort of reconnect with metropolitan science in Europe. He went up into the Upper Plata, doing reconnaissance work, drawn in above all by Paraguayan tea, so much the world of the Jesuits in southern South America. They planted it in their missions. Once the Jesuits were thrown out, the knowledge systems surrounding cultivation of yerba mate left the region with the Jesuits. Bonpland, this was a kind of intellectual conundrum that fascinated him. He found stands of yerba growing on Martin Garcia, in that large island in the estuary of the Rio de Plata between Buenos Aires and Uruguay. That drew him into the interior. He found himself on the borders of Paraguay in a contested zone, and the dictator of Paraguay, Francia, despite the fact that Bonpland reached out openly, explaining what he was doing, that he was trying to resuscitate yerbales, stands of Paraguayan tea cultivation in a former mission. Francia wasn't having any of that and decided that this Frenchman can only be a spy who's out there to undermine Paraguayan national sovereignty, not yet recognized diplomatically by any other South American nation, and he found himself confined under house arrest in the interior of Paraguay, living mainly at a place, Santa Maria da Fe, that I visited this last summer, a place of very modest scale, even in the year 2019. Famous already for his work along the American journey, a long confinement in Paraguay gained Bonpland fame of a different kind, one based on the trials of an intellectual being held hostage. By far the greater part of his residence in Paraguay saw Bonpland confined to living around one of the former Jesuit missions in the southern part of the country. Arriving with no obvious source of income, the psychological stresses of this experience can only have been considerable. While Bonpland had long shown polymath tendencies, medicine, botany, agriculture, and others, these became established patterns during his Paraguayan residence, ones that would hold for the remainder of his life. Thus he combined agriculture, including experimental cultivation, with pharmacy and the practice of medicine. The slow life of rural Paraguay was conducive to field observations, at least within the limited area he was allowed to move. Without ready supplies of paper and ink, writing became an extraordinary challenge, but he solved those things, making ink from the seeds of a particular species, and where paper was concerned, some old ranch accounts from the 18th century turned out handy. He simply wrote on the backs of those. An extraordinary challenge in terms of maintaining any kind of scientific life, and in any case, written contacts with the outside world were forbidden in Francis, Paraguay. So then, resuming a dialogue, he's let out of Paraguay in 1831, and that is something covered by all the major newspapers in the Americas and in Europe. It was something that had a sensational elements to it. Humboldt commented on that. The French Académie des Sciences is covering it and so forth. As during the years following Bonpland's initial arrival in southern South America, Humboldt's influence was important once again for dealing with the French bureaucracy. Humboldt realized that confinement in Paraguay for nearly a decade was a different way of gaining fame than scientific work. He may have worried that Bonpland would slip into obscurity. He says, "The drama having come to an end, he is but a man of science who is traveling for the collection of plants." Humboldt reminded the French authorities of the special nature of the state pension accorded to Bonpland. It was granted in consideration of the herbarium presented by Humboldt to the Jardin des Plantes near the beginning of the 19th century. He says, "I'm now without a single botanical specimen, or even the smallest memento of Chimborazo. The pension, therefore, is one of a very peculiar character." Comments such as this gave Humboldt considerable moral force when dealing with the Paris bureaucrats, because it reminded them of how he'd given up his property in an effort to secure his traveling companion's financial future. As soon as Bonpland had rearranged his affairs to the point that he could travel, he moved south to Buenos Aires on the Atlantic coast for a sojourn in 1832. The context of his domestic life there was now much changed. The family he brought in 1816 from France to the Plata had long departed South America, so he stayed in the house of Pedro de Angelis, an intellectual, probably the owner of the best private library in the region, and an individual Humboldt knew in person from de Angelis's earlier residency in Paris. In Buenos Aires, Bonpland prepared his scientific materials for shipment to Europe. These comprised dried plants, geological specimens, birds, medicinal roots, and much else. The specimens were a mixture of things collected by Bonpland alone in southern South America, and others relating to the earlier journey with Humboldt. He was also able to deal with the bureaucracy of his French pension from Buenos Aires. A spell of residence in the city facilitated the sending of a spate of letters to scientific colleagues in Europe, including to Humboldt. These letters contain very little by way of direct comment on Bonpland's confinement in Paraguay. Comments on the past relate less to Paraguay than the common experience of the work undertaken at the beginning of the 19th century. While the French Minister of Foreign Affairs had cleared the way for Bonpland to return to Europe following Humboldt's initiative, the pull of the Americas seems only to have been growing stronger. Informing Humboldt that he was on his way back to the Portuguese missions, meaning the former Jesuit missions located in the western interior of Brazil's southernmost province, Rio Grande do Sul, he noted that he was often tempted to visit the Patagonian coast, the Malvinas Islands, Tucumán, Chile, and even, if possible, to go through the Strait of Magellan by land. A striking aspect of this list is that it represents a large proportion of the parts of Spanish America Humboldt had not seen in person. It reads in part as Bonpland's struggle as a traveler to retain his authority. But he noted, "I must forcibly resist such onerous projects and content myself for the moment with returning to Europe," always a fiction held out, "via Brazil, a country I have the greatest desire to look at." Borrowing Dorinda Utrum's phrase, this is a fine example of the dance of ambition and vulnerability in which exploration took place. In preparation for these vast plans, Bonpland was keen to see the work of other recent scientific travelers in Brazil, notably those of Frédéric Sello, but especially the today famous studies of his French compatriot, Auguste de Saint-Hilaire. Travel was a competitive business. One way of maintaining authority in it was to provide an informed critique of the work of others. There's a great deal of unpublished material of this kind in Bonpland's working notes. In his next letter to Humboldt from Buenos Aires, Bonpland related that he managed to find a copy of the first 2 volumes of Saint-Hilaire's recently published travel account, which treated south-central Brazil, borrowed from the British minister resident at Buenos Aires. The style soon turned his opinion against this author. He said, "The only thing that's given me pleasure from this journey, Saint-Hilaire's journey, is finding Guarani names in it. These support the idea I have formed of the great expanse of this nation and of the great role it must have played on this continent before, even after, the conquest. I burn with impatience to see again the names and the words that we took from the various tribes, or nations as one should call them, that we came into contact with along the Orinoco." Despite his reservations about Saint-Hilaire's travel account, Bonpland was still keen to see the former's botanical works. "I admire the boldness with which he announces the publication of the most interesting plants of Paraguay, a country he has never been in." Apart from the pension issue, the main reason Bonpland spent months, the French pension issue, trying to get written back in the Golden Book to get the money, the main reason he spent months at Buenos Aires in 1832 was to prepare his collections for the museum at Paris. 25 cases of materials were shipped to Paris late in that year, in late 1832. However, Bonpland was unable, for reasons of travel logistics, to finish immediately his catalogue describing the contents of the cases. He sent it as promptly as circumstances allowed from his home at São Borja, Brazil, at least 700-800 miles upriver from Buenos Aires. He sent the catalogue in January 1833. This original version never reached the administrators at the Jardin des Plantes, leading to serious confusion on both sides of the Atlantic. It's only one, yet a hugely important example of how lines of communication broke down between the metropolitan centers of Europe and the South American interior along the course of Bonpland's long career. Many of the letters between Humboldt and Bonpland were written on birthdays and holidays, alone a fact which seems to point to their enduring friendship. Humboldt's letter on his 66th birthday was full of personal comment and reminiscence. He wrote it uncertain of Bonpland's South American location. The death of his brother Wilhelm had left Humboldt feeling quite lonely at Berlin. Humboldt's discussion also reinforced his connection to Bonpland by kindling memories of some of the South American locations they worked in together, namely Turbaco, Colombia, and Chilo, Ecuador. His letter closed with a brief postscriptum. "You have sent some superb collections." Beyond this, there was no discussion of Bonpland's ongoing work, something that bothered the recipient immensely. His initial written reaction in the draft read, "I would have preferred a bullet to that ironic reproach," which later became the following: that laconic and ironic manner of expressing yourself, dear Humboldt, pierced my heart to the quick. Viewed from Bonpland's perspective, this was a point of maximum stress in his continuing friendship with Humboldt from the distance of South America. When he received Humboldt's letter on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, 1836, at his home in São Borja, Brazil, there'd still been no word from Paris about the reception of his collections sent out from South America in 1832. Money from his French state pension had still to come through. His Brazilian residence was now part of the theater of a major civil war that affected southern Brazil. It is also possible that national holidays laid bare the emotions in an expatriate. Bonpland's extended immediate reply written from a greater degree of physical isolation than was the rule with his South American letters to Humboldt, most of which were written from Buenos Aires or Montevideo, the only two cities of the region. But this letter, written from the interior, is important for what it reveals. Perhaps the most striking single feature of its contents is the light it sheds on Bonpland's own rationale for continuing research in southern South America. He saw himself working there to extend the results of the 1799-1804 field research, both in terms of completing the herbarium and by taking up branches of study not covered along the journey with Humboldt. In regard to the last, he was working mainly to collect specimens of birds. He says, a branch of natural history missing completely in your interesting journey. As often in Bonpland's correspondence, the wording and the structure of drafts vary considerably from the form of the actual letters sent to Humboldt. Various explanations could be given for this, including doubts on Bonpland's part about Humboldt's degree of familiarity with the interior regions of southern South America where he was living. In the draft, he conveyed much more of the sometimes extreme challenges of life in the Americas. First, he lost everything he assembled in Paraguay not once, but twice, in 1829 and in 1831. When finally released by the dictator Francia, he sought to recover materials, collections, money, and capital represented by books deposited over a decade earlier at Corrientes and in Buenos Aires. The fate of his property at the latter appears to have been the worst. What he termed his small herbarium was entirely lost, presumed to be in England, in hands left unspecified. His general herbarium had been deposited in a damp cellar. A large collection of books left at Buenos Aires in 1820 was also missing. What would you have done in my place, my illustrious friend? Bonpland worked to take stock of what remained and then dispatched it to the Paris Museum. The fate of collections was a central issue for maintaining the authority of a researcher such as Bonpland. Vulnerable to the external constraints of South American politics for his ongoing work, a residence in the South American interior was also hardly conducive to governing the fate of earlier collections held in metropolitan centers. The trials of losing things in southern South America were compounded by learning indirectly, probably from the botanist Alia Rappeneau de Lille, of complaints at Paris about the poverty and small numbers of specimens in the Humboldt-Bonpland herbarium stemming from the Great American Journey. Bonpland argued the problem was similar to that experience with his collections of minerals, thinking particularly of the geologist Leopold von Buch. He reminded Humboldt that collaborators remove materials to work on them. He was correct in making this assumption. For example, Kundt took plant specimens from the Humboldt-Bonpland herbarium at Paris to Berlin on his return there in 1829. Furthermore, Bonpland was critical of the lack of support for his ongoing work coming from the French capital, noting he'd like to have as his assistant those at Paris who complained about the condition of his materials so that they would learn the context of his work in the field. The level of Bonpland's distress was such that he took Humboldt's confinement to a brief comment about his collections as criticism. In a word, dear Humboldt, my spirit is pained by your complaints. I have worked for the best, and I cannot believe everything I have sent deserves to be scorned. Bonpland was comparing here the present indifference with the very positive reception of his earlier materials from the Americas. The letter sent to Humboldt, now at Berlin, contains less by way of complaint than the draft. It's somewhat more formal in tone, and Bonpland removed his occasional tendencies to switch from French into Spanish. These slips in the earlier draft were probably a sign of his unconscious assimilation into the local culture. The fate of the botanical materials gathered together in the Americas was long a theme of concern to Humboldt. Now he learned for the first time that Bonpland had included some of this in the things he sent back to Europe from Buenos Aires in 1832. But Bonpland's letter still contained his complaint that Humboldt had said nothing about his work. Humboldt's written reactions are visible in the comments he wrote in French on the margins of Bonpland's letter. Remarking that Bonpland was clearly upset, Humboldt noted he'd never held any intention to express himself ironically. His praise of Bonpland's collections was meant literally. In addition, he remembered there'd been a good deal of backbiting at the Paris Museum. So there's quite a bit more of this sort of back and forth along these years of the 1830s, this matter of throwing out again on Bonpland's part grand projects visiting other parts of the Americas or other parts of the world, the expression of ambitions to extend the geographical orbit of his work and to extend Humboldt's work in the Americas points again, I argue, to issues of authority and the challenges of how to maintain authority while working from the periphery. Well, they grow older, the sentiments of old age. While letters crossed the Atlantic relatively rapidly, and Humboldt had a huge network of intermediaries who could work to forward letters to Bonpland, these could still take a great deal of time to reach the hands of their intended recipient. When Humboldt wrote to Bonpland from Paris in 1843, his letter was not received until September 1849 at Montevideo. In the interim, the dangers of the civil wars then affecting both Argentina and Uruguay had confined Bonpland to his home in the interior. His patterns of movement were curtailed by political instability. The death of Kundt through suicide in 1850 gave Humboldt the chance to do something about the fate of the botanical manuscripts written along the American journey, now a half-century earlier. Humboldt was always consistent about where he wished to see these papers reside. In sending them to the Jardin des Plantes, he reminded the administrators there that the true merit of the botanical work accomplished along the American journey belonged to Bonpland. 2 years later, he informed his collaborator that their botanical manuscripts had been deposited at the Jardin des Plantes, where they remain today. They are your property to dispose of as you wish. I beg you on my knees, dear Bonpland, leave them to Paris, to the Jardin des Plantes, where your name is venerated, although not as much, it would seem, from other references Humboldt made as in England and in Germany. It's a collection of papers showing your immense activity. The interruptions in the lines of communication caused Bonpland anxiety. While Humboldt had written south more than once in 1853, Bonpland is still to see these letters when he sat down on Christmas Day of the same year to compose a letter running to several thousand words. Since Humboldt's letter of March 1850, nothing further had come through to South America. I've looked in vain for your name in the Rio de Janeiro newspapers, which we read rigorously every month at São Borja, a very small town. I'm reduced to reading and rereading your last letter. He thanked Humboldt for sending the 2 volumes, the Tableau de la Nature, presumably something he would already have read in its initial 1808 French edition. He'd also seen the first volume of the Cosmos, first published in French translation of Paris in 1846, at the residence of the Brazilian chargé d'affaires to Uruguay. Humboldt is today commemorated in Latin America far more than any other portion of the world. Yet Bonpland's comments reveal that his studies were not things of easy access there during his lifetime. Bonpland says, "It's inconceivable to see the rarity, if not the nullity, of your learned books here at Buenos Aires and probably throughout the rest of South America." Bonpland agreed with Humboldt that their manuscripts from the shared American journey should be deposited in the Paris Museum, but this also gave him an opportunity to lay out a part of his own philosophy. Between the two of us, for me it's a real question whether a traveler should entrust notes and manuscripts to the public. What one writes along a journey can never be complete. The notes a traveler takes can only be written up well by the traveler himself, who retains in mind a multitude of things which even a note, a very brief and incomplete description, will remind him. However, I'm convinced our botanical manuscripts and our sketches and drawings will be of interest. In Bonpland's concern for completeness, we grasp some of the reason why his rate of publication was slow in the period, botanical publication was slow in the period he worked with Humboldt. His comment can also be read as gentle criticism of Humboldt for taking on collaborators, Wildenau and then Kundt, to accomplish the work of the botanical publications. The points raised with Humboldt form part of a broader pattern evident in Bonpland's letters to other authorities, including the distinguished botanists de Candolle and Mirbel, the French pioneer of microscopy. In the changing sense of space in natural history, Bonpland was a consistent defender of empirical observations. He maintained for numerous authorities that the properties of plant materials have been too much neglected In his view, only direct field experience led to satisfactory botanical publications. In 1856, the University of Greifswald conferred an honorary doctorate on Bonpland as part of the anniversary of that university, marking 400 years from its foundation. That led to certain correspondence. Bonpland, in writing a letter of thanks, said that he considered his most valuable work had been working as Humboldt's collaborator on the American journey. Every day I celebrate having been useful to him, of having maintained a friendship with him that is truly reciprocal and of which he has given me multiple proofs. But the letter also conveyed a certain ambivalence. The lack of comment on the materials he sent to Europe in the 1830s seems to have taken its toll. Bonpland noted that when he sent a collection of 154 specimens of southern South American rocks to Paris, his shipment was accompanied by 2 descriptive manuscript catalogues, one destined for the administrators of the Paris Museum, the other for Humboldt. Bonpland asked the professors of the museum to make his minerals available to Humboldt for study. Specimens, as he says, in sufficient number, chosen and prepared as the most famous traveler of our era, taught me. Since that shipment, more than 20 years have unfolded without my being able to learn whether my wishes were fulfilled. Bonpland pointed out that his southern South American botanical collections did not compare in scale with the work he accomplished with Humboldt in the tropics. This was correct. The part-time research over 40 years in southern South America resulted in 2,449 botanical descriptions, in comparison with 4,528 entries during the work with Humboldt. Still, he saw the prolonged study of plant materials from a more confined area as advantageous. This had facilitated his knowledge of the properties and uses of individual species. Bonpland dies, of course, slightly before Humboldt in May 1858. That led to a long matter on Humboldt's part of trying to sort out what to do with any remaining materials in South America, and I'm going quickly here. They had different ideas about where to distribute materials, Humboldt being certain that centralization and the metropolitan was the way to go, and Bonpland rather more involved in the idea of building up scientific enterprise in parts of the periphery. But the conclusion to Humboldt's last letter, never read by Bonpland, alas, reads movingly, "There's nobody on this earth more given to you in heart and soul than me." Heinz Schneppen has rightly argued that the friendship between Humboldt and Bonpland was not alone a thing of the head and of calculation. George Sarton considered that while Humboldt has been reckoned one of the most fortunate men of science that ever lived, Bonpland's a good example of infortune. It's truly impressive how Humboldt stood by Bonpland throughout the considerable trials of his generally conflicted life in South America. He even worked with only mixed success to secure Bonpland's reputation after the latter's death. However, the stresses that accompanied lines of distance, both physical and psychological, are, I think, clearly revealed in the correspondence that I'm talking about today. A clear picture emerges of the vulnerability of the traveler dancing in the shadows of the often shifting norms of metropolitan institutions. In reviewing the collaboration between Bonpland and Humboldt after 1817, a good deal of evidence shows how Bonpland struggled along the decades to maintain his authority, both by seeking to extend the aerial scope of the American journey and by taking up branches of study Humboldt had left aside. Above all, Bonpland was a traveler who consistently argued the case for the importance of field observations, devoting so much of his life to these. He'd certainly not spent his days in quiet inaction, as was argued in the famous 19th century Karl Brunn's biography of Humboldt. Beyond the thousands of plant descriptions, many of them accompanied by extensive ethnobotanical notes, his manuscripts on such commodities as Paraguayan tea and tobacco present instead the picture of a committed researcher. The vicissitudes of politics in South America were such that Bonpland was never able to realize his publication ambitions despite a huge effort on his part. Holding always to the ambition of publishing his own work, only a few of his findings reach print in his own lifetime, and then mainly through the agency of others, despite publication offers reaching South America coming from such distinguished colleagues as A.P. de Candolle and William Jackson Hooker. His findings on Paraguayan tea were of sufficient importance that they eventually formed the core material for a series of 19th century British, French, and German publications. Near the beginning of the 19th century, Cuvier had criticized field naturalists because their contact with their objects of study was only fleeting. The sharp division posited in the literature between the experiences of space of the field naturalists and the sedentary scholars does not fit for all. Bonpland's arrangement of space showed a conscious effort to draw on the attractive features of both styles. For example, he maintained homes in regions that were ecotones. These homes served many of the functions of research stations, something that's not visible in the surviving imagery of these places, which focus only on the external characteristics of the modest buildings. The whole sort of, this is a man who's gone native trope by looking at the modesty of homes is a little bit dangerous, because you need to be thinking about what are these homes used for beyond residence in a scientific sense. In at least one key respect, Bonpland had more success than some of his colleagues who are today famous for their published travel descriptions. His field notes have the virtue that they allow for the sustained analysis of places through time. And so, despite the challenges of an archive divided between Europe and South America, the value of Bonpland's work for understanding the environmental history of Southern South America is now finally starting to appear. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll follow the impromptu convention we started yesterday. One great question. Yes, Elizabeth.
Well, I don't know if it's a great question, but I really appreciated that talk, so thank you for bringing attention to Bonpland, because he often does get marginalized. I was wondering what you think, as you were speaking of the disharmony in his work, that was fascinating to me, and you sketched out nicely some of the reasons for that lack of harmony, in that he didn't have well, that's something I would want to press you on a little bit more. What do you think is the leading cause of that disharmony? Because at times it seemed that it was just kind of unhappy fate, that had he had the right conditions, maybe that disharmony would have evaporated. But sometimes it seemed as if he wasn't, especially in those nice details you gave from the correspondence, that he wasn't much interested in creating the harmony that you get when you publish your material and control it in the way that Humboldt did. But I also wondered, as you were speaking of this unhappy fate that he was suffering while he was imprisoned, basically, in Paraguay, if some of the things that were saddling him were the same things that continue to saddle scholars. Having worked in Venezuela, I realized that people in Latin America still are somehow left out sometimes of more mainstream intellectual discussion, simply because of the political instability of the region. So if you saw something there too, so it's a kind of two-pronged question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fine question. It's just that sort of getting to the heart of Bonpland is not, to my way of thinking, an easy thing. Here I am picking up this idea of disharmony, but that's really a European charge that's level from outside. And if I think carefully about it, yes, there is a commitment to publish. He's very stubborn about it. He picks up with de Candolle at a certain point after many years of no communication, and he sends a letter asking de Candolle about botanical publication in Europe. And de Candolle says, you can forget this idea of elephant-sized folios. The public doesn't want any of this. The reading tastes have changed. It's not the Napoleonic. It's all very specific and goes on and on and on. And what does Bonpland do? He rejects the practical advice that de Candolle gives him. If you come back to Europe, it needs to be Paris or Munich or Geneva, the specific locations where you can make it make it work, and he's sitting sort of dreaming, calculating costs on the back of the back of the letter. There's a certain stubbornness. There's an ego somewhere here. But yes, I mean that the experiences of daily life were not easy. He could have made his life easier. I don't, you know, the counterfactual to the reality would be, why on earth didn't he just stay in Buenos Aires province? Once the political possibilities were clear, once General Rosas was out of the picture, foreigners were making a fortune doing fine wool sheep farming. He knew all about that from France, from the Empress Josephine in the early 19th century. He had, I suppose, the kind of questing mind, a polymath mind, where he couldn't settle very much to one thing at once. And the irony is that Paraguay was probably a rather happy phase of his life, despite the fact that he couldn't communicate with any of his fellow authorities who were sitting around in the Jardin des Plantes. They talk about him in their seance, and of course the missions to rescue him. I don't have time here to talk about all of these things, but being confined to a certain physical area and start from ground zero, practice medicine, make your own remedies from plant materials. We're very, very, very gifted in things like pharmacy, and if you run out of money, you can even start doing some distilling. All of the etiquettes from the Bonpland firm are in the archive in Buenos Aires. We start making eau de vie and things like that. It's clearly psychologically a very complicated life. Politics does stand very much in the way. He was not able to spend all that much time in secure locations like Buenos Aires and Montevideo. And when he was in those places, he was as active as hell at getting down and writing and catching up and wanting to know what's being published in botany, getting hold of materials. I think the commentary that he offers on Humboldt's publications in South America is very important. I mean, we've got this Mary Louise Pratt idea that Humboldt is this second discoverer after of the Americas, but the harsh reality is that Humboldt's works in the period of Humboldt's life are not readily available, it seems, even in the larger cities of South America. So the kind of connection culturally that Latin America has with Humboldt today is something of a very, very different order than it was in the 19th century. Sorry, I don't know that I'm answering your question yet. I'm going down too many different tracks here, but I'm trying. Thank you.
Again, Stephen.
No, you're welcome.
Now I get to say ecologist Stephen Jackson.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Oop. And let me turn myself on here. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the invitation. It's a real honor to speak with this group, and especially to have the last word on it. Is that too loud? Just what's coming over the speakers? Let's try it down there. Okay. Yeah, because I can hear myself, and it's very creepy. So yeah, it's a real honor to be with this group. I'm especially with people who are true Humboldt scholars. I do Humboldt scholarship, but it's a great honor to be with this particular group. I'm actually an ecologist and scientist. And actually, my day job is science administrator or science bureaucrat. So science is now something I do as kind of a side hobby, and Humboldt is one of the kind of side things that I do to keep myself sane. So I'm going to talk some about Humboldt, but I'm going to try to put him in a broader context today of the kinds of things that are happening in our world and will continue to be happening throughout our lifetimes, and talk about both how Humboldt's contributed to our understanding of some of those kinds of things that are happening, and also how he may be able to provide some guidelines and some assistance to us in navigating our way through some of the big challenges that we face societally and environmentally. And so it's no secret that we're dealing now, confronting on a worldwide scale with three deeply interlinked environmental challenges that, and these are challenges that are not just environmental, they're societal. These are challenges that get at the very roots of the sustainability of our societies and cultures, and by some arguments, even our species. And they include the loss of biodiversity. We've understood this and recognized this since the 19th century, and we're seeing accelerating loss of biodiversity, both in terms of genetic diversity and species extinctions, degradation of ecosystem services, different kinds of human activities on the land, disrupting everything from primary productivity to pollinators to water quality and quantity to different feedbacks on the climate system, soil fertility and forest productivity and so forth. And then the third, that, and again, that's one that we've had a pretty good idea and has certainly got received a lot of attention over the past few decades. And the one that's really been emerging fast and we've known about for 50, 60 years, but is coming on at an accelerating rate and is affecting us a lot faster than most of us, including myself, had anticipated even as recently as 10, 15 years ago, is global climate change. In fact, almost every year, seemingly almost every month, I'm having to reset myself because things are happening faster than we would have predicted. And since that's kind of my day job is centered on climate change, it's getting a lot of my attention. Now, of course, these are getting a lot of attention in the press and internationally. Of course, we've got these international programs, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been around for, I think, 30-something years. And more recently, in the past 5 years, the development of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They just put out their general summary or their first global assessment a few months ago that got a lot of press, and again just shows some of the gravity of the situation with these. So getting back to Humboldt, Humboldt provides a lot of perspective on these, and the science underlying our attention to these issues derives directly from Humboldt and his predecessors and contemporaries and the various people that he's influenced since then. He contributed to the fundamental science underlying biodiversity and ecosystem services and global climate change and global climate change's impacts on natural resources in the environment. He has influenced our understanding and, in fact, identified, in many cases, the human causes of some of these issues. I'll give a couple of examples of that. And he also can help inform us on why this all matters and, again, how we might be able to navigate our way through some of these challenges in the future. So just going back to starting with the fundamental science, Humboldt reveled in biodiversity. And this is something we should celebrate. It's something that came up yesterday in the discussion. This is something we should celebrate among ourselves as natural scientists. Most ecologists, most naturalists, taxonomists, systematists, we go into the science in part because they're interesting questions and they're relevant societal challenges, but most of us also have some love or appreciation for the beauty and mystery and activity out there in the natural world. For me, it was just a pleasure to spend a couple minutes looking at the trees and remembering some of my old dendro friends from when I used to live in the East. And of course, Humboldt's monographs, the ones that he spent most of his fortune on during his sojourn in Paris, are full of these rich illustrations. He hired some of the best artists and lithographers and printers to be able to accompany all of his monographs with all of these detailed illustrations. And again, I think this was partly his artistic appreciation, but also his appreciation for the diversity of life, all these crazy things that he was finding in the tropics and that he wrote very eloquently about in his correspondence and in his personal narrative and in Views of Nature and elsewhere. So, and this is really part of the fundamental science underlying biodiversity and ultimately ecosystem services and climate change. And again, Humboldt did not start this, but he was certainly a great accelerator of these kinds of surveys. And one of the most important things, or one of his most important contributions, and really unique ones, was his rigor and discipline in describing the geographic location of the specimens that he described and collected with Bonpland and with others. Everything that he did, every measurement that he took, every specimen that he collected, every measurement that he took of air temperature or humidity or atmospheric chemistry or whatever was georeferenced. He tried to determine as best he could and as precisely as he could the latitude, longitude, and elevation of every one of those observations and every one of those collections, recognizing that that was key to understanding these larger issues, in this particular case, of why species occur where they do and why they do not occur where they do not occur, and to really understand those determinants. And in fact, the essay on the geography of plants, the first paragraph, is a call to arms and a critique of botany, and I think implicitly other parts of natural history, and the obsession with simply describing new species without putting them in the environmental context and putting them in their geographic context. And he recognized that in order to be able to understand the geography of biodiversity, the geography of life, and the determinants of it, you needed to have that kind of both the georeferencing, what we now call georeferencing, and also the accompanying environmental information. So again, he measured lots and lots of stuff. This was discussed yesterday. One can spend, as I have, many hours in just looking at this diagram and just pulling out all of the rich information in there. He measured lots of different kinds of things. Many of these were directly relevant to the geography of plants and geography of animals and the other things he was interested in. One that's interesting is that along this Chimborazo profile, he measured the blueness of the sky. And a number of my scientific colleagues have puzzled publicly about why did he do that? That seems odd. Maybe he was just a little, he had some crazy idea that the blueness of the sky somehow determined plant distribution or something. That, I think, was aesthetic. He measured the blueness of the sky because it pleased him to think about the changes in the color of the sky as one ascended in elevation, and that it was simply pleasing to the mind and to the eye, and that's why he tried to quantify it and describe it. So this is continually, everything that he did was a mix of rigorous science but also aesthetics in his natural history. So moving on to the human impacts on biodiversity, he certainly recognized some of the looming threats to biodiversity. There are many anecdotes in the personal narrative and in the Views of Nature, particularly in the footnotes about this. Just a couple of examples. In the personal narrative, he takes this trip while he's in Venezuela to the Cueva del Guacharo, to look at the cave, but particularly the oil birds. This is a species of bird that they're nocturnal and they feed on oil palm seeds. So they have a very fat-rich diet, and they store large amounts of oil in their bodies. And he notes that the local people would go in there into the cave where these birds nested and get poles and sticks and knock the nests down and capture the birds, particularly the nestlings, which were particularly oil-rich, and they would harvest them and boil them down to render the fat, which would then be used for torches, for lamps, and to some extent as a food source. And there was a very big market for these birds, and he noted that this harvesting threatened this population of birds with extinction. But he also noted that there were parts of the cave that were inaccessible, that either for superstitious reasons, the local people wouldn't go into some of the darkest recesses, or they simply couldn't climb the cliffs to get to some of the smaller caves. So he noted that the population could recover and bounce back from those refugial areas. So this is a very early insight into what's now a common principle in community and population ecology of metapopulations. Of course, this was before population ecology, but he was getting the idea of a population could be threatened with extinction, but it could be restored, or it could bounce back if it could be rescued periodically by immigration from some refugial or safer sources. He also talked on his Venezuelan journey about the turtle egg harvesting on the Orinoco River. There's an extensive passage about their spending time on a sandbar in the Orinoco and talking about the local people, digging up the turtle eggs. And there was a major industry of rendering these fat-rich turtle eggs into oil that would then be taken downriver and sold in the villages and ultimately the cities, again, primarily as fuel for lamps and lights. And again, he indicated that if this goes on, it's going to affect the turtle populations and they may in fact disappear. So he had an appreciation very early on for these kinds of threats. I think things happened faster than he or anyone had anticipated. So Karl Bodmer was a German artist who accompanied Prince Maximilian of Wied on an expedition up to the foothills of the Rockies in the early 1830s, and they did a sojourn at New Harmony, Indiana, and while there, Bodmer painted this nice painting. It's very Humboldtian. You can recognize the tree species, the Arundinaria overhanging the river, the bald eagle there. But what I want to bring your attention to are these birds up in the tree. This isn't a very good rendition, but a better reproduction that I've looked at. Those are recognizable as Carolina parakeets. And the only place you can see those now are stuffed specimens like this in museums. They disappeared around the turn of the 20th century. Nobody really saw that coming. I'm not sure anybody really anticipated their decline or the decline of the passenger pigeon, which was even more abundant than these parakeets. Both of those birds were all over the east. They would have been flying around the trees here outside just about any day, and yet they went very, very rapidly. Another insight that Humboldt had was invasive species. Again, this is not original with him, but he certainly recognized it. And of course, being in North Carolina, I had to put some kudzu up there. But he noted that man, when expatriating himself, this is a 19th century translation, is desirous that everything should change country with him. We bring stuff along with us, plants and insects and birds and mammals and so forth. So we certainly recognized intercontinental translocation of species. To him, it was primarily a bother in just trying to understand biogeography and these distributions he was trying to work out because they kind of muddle the story. But again, we're recognizing now that many of these species are major threats to biodiversity and ecosystem services, and in some cases, completely transforming the ecosystems that they're invading. Of course, another important fundamental scientific contribution was climatic control of vegetation structure, not just the distributions, the geographic distributions we talked about earlier, but the fundamental structure of vegetation, whether it's tundra or woodland or forest or grassland or whatever. And of course, that's illustrated in this beautiful diagram published in 1817, showing the profiles of different mountain ranges, all the way from the tropics to the temperate zone to the high latitudes of Lapland, and showing, again, both the decrease in snow line with latitude and the displacement of the vegetation zones. Again, fundamental science that's very important to our understanding of the world today. And a very important insight of Humboldt's was that he was highly concerned with vegetation, and I don't think it's any coincidence that the first publication out following his voyage with Bonpland was the essay on the geography of plants, and that profile of Chimborazo, because he really viewed vegetation or recognized that vegetation is the intermediary between the atmosphere, the climate, and the land surface, and it's the intermediary between human activities and experience on the surface of the earth and the environment overall, that we depend on vegetation, vegetation is a major determinant of animal species distributions, a major determinant of soils. It influences hydrology, erosion, sedimentation, all these different kinds of things that occur in the critical zone. He recognized that if you disturb the vegetation, you can have grave consequences for the land surface and even the atmosphere. This is a recent satellite image of Lake Valencia that he visited in 1800. You can see just the extensive urbanization and land clearance and disturbance around the watershed. Of course, it wasn't quite that extensive when he was there, but most of the surrounding mountains and landscape had been cleared, and much of the flats around the lake had been cultivated. And so there's this well-known passage in the personal narrative where he talks about this at Valencia, about the destruction of forests, the clearing of plains, the cultivation of indigo, and its effects on hydrology and on both the groundwater and the climate. By felling the trees that cover the tops and the sides of mountains, men in every climate prepare at once two calamities for future generations: the want of fuel, a vital ecosystem service, and a scarcity of water, another vital ecosystem service. The destruction of forests, the want of permanent springs, and the existence of torrents are three phenomena closely connected together. And this is one of the passages that Marsh read and that influenced his thinking so much, and led he and many others to really start looking closely at the human impact on the landscape and the consequences for the landscape as well as for human welfare. I guess his final major contribution, which really takes us up to global change, is what he outlined in the essay on the geography of plants, this physique générale du monde, or general physics of the earth. This is a really important work, published in 1807. I think of this as the microcosmos. That this is sort of the prolegomena, anyway, the thing that the synopsis of the vision that he tried to synthesize and pull together through the rest of his career, culminating in Cosmos, and it's all packed in, or many of these ideas are packed into this, which is far more than an essay on the geography of plants. It's an essay on the general physics of the earth, and covers a great deal of territory. Most of the text is an elaborate caption to this figure. And he walks you through the figure and discusses the details of it in the underlying physics and chemistry and biology and anthropology and so forth of this. This is really I see the geography, the essay on the geography of plants as a primary starting point, not only for the fields of ecology and biogeography, but also to this larger enterprise of earth system science, climate science, sustainability science, whatever it goes by various rubrics. But much of it really traces down to the vision that he laid out in this document, showing how the importance of climate in influencing and determining vegetation and species distribution, and then the reciprocal influences of vegetation back on the climate, but also the influences of vegetation on these different landscape properties, and putting all that together in a synthesis. The thing that he left unstated in that document was, or at least only implicit, and didn't say much about in most of his writing, although he alludes to it in places, is that if you change the climate, you're going to change how things appear on the landscape. You're going to change distributions and vegetation structure and all these other kinds of things. And which takes me to I guess what I call unripe fruits of his career, things that weren't fully developed, at least not directly by Humboldt, and at least one of which really did not develop fully until well after his death, but at least they both do have some roots and origins in his thinking. One is Earth's environmental history. The other one is the effect of greenhouse gases, and particularly human-produced greenhouse gases in the Earth system and its effects on climate. So this is the portrait that Charles Willson Peale painted of Humboldt during his visit to Philadelphia in 1804. Just 2 years after Peale painted this portrait, he painted this, the exhumation of the mastodon. Peale learned, he had a museum in Philadelphia and of natural history and various kinds of objects and artifacts, and he learned that some mastodon bones had been found up near Troy, New York. So he invested a considerable amount of labor and money into the exhumation, the formal exhumation of the mastodon, and then painted this elaborate operation. Of course, Peale being Peale, he included himself in the painting, directing the whole thing, and of course he included all of his family and close friends because why not? They need to be part of that. So Humboldt was in Humboldt's lifetime, during his active period, paleontology was getting underway. We were becoming aware of that weird beasts like these elephant-like creatures had roamed the landscape not that long ago. Cuvier had already published much of his work, and again, even in North America, we were finding ground sloths and mastodons, and in Europe, they were finding mammoths and Irish elk and various other kinds of things. So this was definitely in the air. Humboldt didn't spend a lot of time early in his career in those influential writings talking about Earth history or paleontology, with the one exception being this little-known volume in 1823, a geognostical essay on the superposition of rocks in both hemispheres. This is a largely forgotten work now. If you look at in the geological history literature, William Smith gets lots of credit, which he deserves. He did that beautiful color geologic map of England that had a huge influence on stratigraphy and terminology and paleontology. But this work of Humboldt's was, in its time, probably as or more influential than Smith. But again, it's largely forgotten, perhaps because it's not a color map. But it is an effort at synthesizing at a global scale the different rocks of the earth and expanding on some of the things that he laid out in the essay on the geography of plants. This does not say much about recent time. He's looking mostly at rocks and not softer sediments. This work did have a very strong influence on Charles Lyell, who corresponded with Humboldt, and Lyell credits Humboldt's monograph with influencing the principles of geology, which is what really created geology as a coherent science. One thing that I don't know very much about that I'm just going to drop in here is another of Humboldt's contemporaries was a Danish scholar named Japetus Steenstrup, who was at the Copenhagen Natural History Museum and the University of Copenhagen. Steenstrup's probably best known for his work on squids and his work on barnacles. He was actually Darwin's closest correspondent when Darwin was writing his barnacle monographs. But for his doctoral dissertation in the 1830s, what he did was go out into the forest in Denmark and dig up a couple of bogs. Excavated the bogs, and then identified the different layers of plant materials that were in those bogs, and developed the first sequence that I'm aware of going backwards from the present, continuing through the past several hundred, the past several thousand years, looking at how vegetation had changed, how the hydrology of these bogs had changed, and ultimately how the climate had changed. So Lyell and Smith and many other people were primarily concerned at the time with change over the full duration of Earth's history. Steenstrup was interested in just what had been happening in the last few thousand years since the glaciers retreated from Denmark. So this is really the origin of paleoecology. This is, as far as I can tell, this is the first paleoecological study of its kind, which ultimately led to the later works of Blut and Sernander, both students of Steenstrup, and ultimately to Leonard von Post and pollen analysis and so forth, and basically created this field that I've spent most of my career in. So I can't resist putting in a plug for paleoecology, which is what I've done. And it just so happens that the most recent paper I have published in paleoecology, my little hobby science, is from South Carolina, just south of maybe a couple hundred miles south of here, down near Columbia. And so the vertical horizon, or the vertical scale here, is age, going back from the present back to 30,000 years ago. The silhouettes represent the relative abundance of pollen of different trees and shrubs and herbs. And so this gives us an idea of how climate has changed over the past 30,000 years and how vegetation has changed over the past 30,000 years, and also potentially how human activities may have influenced the vegetation since humans came onto the landscape. I won't spend a lot of time with this, but I'll just note that 20,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum. That's when we last had ice sheets over much of northeastern North America. And at that time, this pond was surrounded by vegetation dominated by pines. And the pines, it turns out, are mostly jack pine. Boreal pine, something you'd have to go to New Hampshire to find even a few scattered individuals, and you'd have to go deep into the Canadian Shield to find large populations. So the southern pines, the loblollies and longleafs and shortleafs and so forth, were not around. They were displaced to the south. There's a period during the last deglaciation, where the pines go down and we get a mix of hardwoods, including things like beech and hickory and so forth, hophorn beam, that's representing a warming climate and also a moistening climate. and then another phase of mixed pine and oak in the early Holocene, and then finally development of the native pine forests in the past few thousand years. So the bottom line here is that the environment changes naturally, climate changes naturally, and ecosystems respond in various ways. This is nothing new. Again, this is something that Humboldt just barely got an inkling of. I'd love to know what he was thinking about as he was developing Cosmos or those final chapters that never got written. Just as another thing along these lines is that you can use these kinds of records to look at how much change there has been since the last glacial maximum. So another thing that I did with a grad student and about 30 colleagues from around the world was we took records like this and asked the question, how much has vegetation changed between the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago and today? And it turns out both compositionally and structurally it's changed a lot. There are few places on the planet that have not undergone profound ecological turnover in the past 10,000 years, or 20,000 years. Which is actually kind of a gobstopper. We tend to think of ecological stability and antiquity and so forth, and yet climate change is nothing new to the planet. Ecological responses to climate change is nothing new. There is some, ecosystems have experienced climate change before, which is kind of good news because it indicates there's some adaptive capacity out there. But the kind of climate change that we're seeing now is of a whole new rate and magnitude than relative to what we've seen in the past. I put this up here just because I love this quote because it's kind of, summarizes what I've been trying to do with my own work, looking into the drifting out of the present and into the darkness of prehistory to get a sense of what we cannot yet clearly discern. And again, I think that's why history is so important because it tells us things that we cannot see currently. Just very quickly on greenhouse gases. Humboldt's contemporaries, Fourier and Pouillet, whom he surely knew while he was in Paris, are really at the origins of our understanding of atmospheric or greenhouse gas forcing of the climate. Fourier did calculations that indicated that given the size of the Earth and its distance from the sun, the Earth should be a hell of a lot colder than it is. In fact, it should be sub-freezing from poles to equator. And so he surmised from those calculations, that the atmosphere must have some kind of insulating property, although he really didn't understand what it was. Pouillet went a little bit further and did some more calculations and suggested that water vapor and carbon dioxide were among those primary greenhouse gases. But it wasn't until John Tyndall reported, just a couple of weeks before Humboldt died, he reported in London at a meeting the results of his experiments that showed that water vapor and carbon dioxide had these greenhouse properties, that they would absorb light energy and then re-radiate it as heat. Very fundamental discovery, but something that wasn't available to Humboldt at the time. And it was still decades later, in the late 1890s, before Svante Arrhenius did the calculations to show exactly what the relationship was between CO2 and water vapor concentration and how much they affected the radiative budget. He was the first to really quantify that. But again, the roots were there. But I think it took a lot of hard work, including the physics and chemistry that Tyndall and Arrhenius and others did before we could really get there. But Humboldt, it'd be interesting to look at Humboldt's correspondence or conversations with Fourier and Pouillet and to see how much he was involved in their thinking. So again, we know that we're on this trajectory of increasing CO2. The the latest IPCC projections are looking pretty warm. RCP 2.6, frankly, we're beyond that. And unless we do things at a global scale radically fast, we're going to overshoot 2.6. We're well on the way to that. And frankly, I don't think it's realistic anymore. I think 4.5 is the best we can hope for. And right now, we're still pretty much heading towards 8.5, which is a pretty extreme, rapid warming of the globe. Just going back, and that's, I won't go into the details here, but going back to that Nolan et al. Paper, we were able to use the sensitivities that we calculated from the past responses to the temperature difference between the last glacial maximum and today, and use that to estimate the amount of vegetation change at a global scale to these greenhouse scenarios, to 2.6 and 8.5. And with 8.5, you get pretty much vegetation transformation everywhere, large-scale ecosystem transformation in terms of both vegetation composition and vegetation structure. Since Humboldt's day, of course, we've had a proliferation, amplification, and acceleration of stresses. Of course, not just climate change. That's the one that's piling on now after the land clearances and land cover conversions and various other kinds of disturbances that have happened. There is no place on Earth that has been unaffected by human activities. There's no corner of the Earth where you can't find some trace of human impact. And we're seeing, particularly if you go out into the western US where I live and work, we're seeing the consequences of this at very broad scales. This is Sequoia National Park a couple of winters ago so what we're experiencing now are, we've been in drought since 1999. Last winter was relatively wet. I'm not sure what this winter is going to be like, but before last winter, things have been dry for a long time. But they're not only unusually dry, they're unusually hot. So we have drought that's accompanied by record high temperatures, and that's putting huge stresses on the ecosystems that is leading to the large wildfires that we're seeing in the forests and now in the chaparral and in the woodlands and grasslands across the West and most notably in California. But we're also seeing mortality, both trees dying, adult trees dying, sometimes mostly because of drought-related susceptibility to pests and pathogens, but we're actually seeing physiological induced death in some cases, where trees are actually dying because they cannot cope with the combination of the high temperatures and the drought stress. The managers and scientists who have been in place in many of our national parks and national forests in the West are saying they're seeing things that they've never seen before and that their predecessors have never seen before. We're already kind of going off the charts on a lot of this stuff. In many cases, fundamental, irreversible ecosystem transformations are underway. When we have these mass mortality events, like these huge wildfires or these other mortality events coming during a time of climate change, what was there before is not being replaced. So this landscape before the Aspen fire in 2003, this was beautiful old growth, magnificent gallery stands of ponderosa pines. It's come back as woodland, shrubland, and it's not going back to ponderosa. There's no regeneration. This is a conversion of forest into shrubland with all kinds of consequences for everything from albedo to runoff to surface temperatures and so forth. And again, we're seeing this all over the West, and we're starting to see it in other parts of the world, in marine systems, where we're seeing these permanent conversions underway. So this creates a huge dilemma for managers and policymakers and society. What do you do in the face of change And do you resist? Do we try to restore those forests and get them back to what they were before, and maintain the ponderosa pine forests, or maintain the sequoia groves, or the rangelands, or whatever? At what cost? For how long? Can we do this in the face of a changing climate? If the climate is moving out of a space that can sustain those forests, then is it worth? Is that a good investment of our time and money? Or do we simply accept the change and just say, okay, whatever comes in, we'll accept and we'll deal with? Or do we try to direct the change? Do we take these disturbances as an opportunity to try to engineer the ecosystems in directions that will maintain whatever we're trying to get out of them, whether it's biodiversity, ecosystem services, aesthetic value, ethical values, or whatever? And given that the change is not ending, it's we're going to be seeing continual change for the foreseeable future. We can't even define the endpoints very well. And in some cases, we certainly can't resist. Like we can't resist retreating glaciers, like the Mulholland Glacier, which in my lifetime, actually halfway back in my lifetime, was here. And that's something we're not going to reverse in a direct way. But ecosystems, we do have more opportunity. And so, but these are really difficult questions. These are science questions, but they're science questions laden with uncertainty, but they're also values questions that we have to grapple with. So we're in a period that Funtowitz and Roberts described long ago as post-normal. We're in a post-normal period where doing science in the old ways and the old relationships between science and society no longer work in the face, or will no longer be effective in the face of the kinds of environmental challenges that we are seeing, because the uncertainties are very high. We cannot predict. I won't go into it now, but I'm happy to elaborate later. We cannot predict the future state of these ecosystems as climate evolves. So there's gigantic uncertainty, and also the stakes are really, really huge. Life on Earth, sustainability of society, and so forth. So we have to dump the false dichotomies. I think one of the things we need to do is do a little bit of clearance, get rid of some of these false dichotomies of science or humanities, science or values, people or nature, et cetera. We have to recognize that conservation is an intersection of science and values. There's a portion of the conservation community that asserts that conservation is simply science and that it's value-free, which I think is absurd, but there is still a very deeply entrenched view to that effect. And I think we need to recognize that it is an intersection of values. We need to reinvent conservation science. We're still kind of inheriting the conservation that was developed in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And I think we need to re-examine it because the science has changed. We weren't thinking about climate change back then. We didn't know anything about it. And the relationship between science and society was very different. That was a more normal time then. So, we reinvent science all the time, and I think it's due for another reinvention. And of course, values are changing. The values that are embedded are evolving. I don't think I need to elaborate on this, but this landscape would bring together, it would bring different kinds of thoughts depending on whether we were living in the, if we were Western Europeans or Euro-Americans living in the 1700s, we'd have a very different view of this than if we were living in the 1800s or 1900s or whatever. And even within there would be a lot of diversity of perceptions of this landscape as awesome and awe and grandeur, and sublimity or terror or money or ecosystem services or backpacking or what, lots of different values that are evolving. So I think Humboldt can speak to our current concerns. We need to go back to his vision of humanistic science and embrace nature and humanity, science and values together. humanity and nature are locked in this lopsided coevolution where nature's going to come out okay. We are influencing it, and we are taking out species, and we are transforming landscapes in irreversible ways, but nature will abide. There will be biodiversity, there will be ecosystems. The question is, will we abide? And that's what I mean by how lopsided this is. We're a major driver, but in this coevolution, we're a partner that nature could get along without. I just want to close with someone painted by another member of the Peel family and someone who obviously had a close relationship and correspondence with Humboldt. One of my favorite quotes from Jefferson is, "Science is my passion. Politics is my duty." Because Jefferson was a scientist. He loved doing science. That's what he really would rather have been doing. But he felt politics was his duty, which is why he did many of the different things that he did. And I think this is something we should all be thinking about as scientists, as scholars, as decision makers, as citizens, whatever we are, that scholarship or science may be our passion, but we do have a duty to engage in politics. And I don't mean politics in the sense of, I'm a federal employee, so I've got to stay on the right side of the Hatch Act. I don't mean going out and advocating for politicians or running for office or whatever. I would encourage you to do that, but rather to engage in the politics of discussion and engagement outside the academy and doing things that will help mitigate some of these kinds of issues. Because again, we're in serious trouble with these environmental problems. These are not going away. They are getting worse, and they are accelerating. And so we're going to need to engage more and more. And ultimately, these are personal and moral decisions. I made a moral choice 7 years ago to get out of the academy and to go into a government bureaucracy because I felt that was something that needed to be done. And I don't say everybody should do that, but for me, with the skill sets and the interest and the experience that I had, I just said, okay, here's a place where I can have more impact than I am having as an academic. So I would encourage you to all to just, again, think about how to address these various chasms between whatever discipline or profession you're in and those other professions or disciplines or sectors of society that you might need to engage in. And I think this is a very Humboldtian enterprise because, again, he was not merely a scientist, he was also a humanist and saw these relationships, I think, very clearly. So thank you.
Quick question of fact on what you're showing the graph on the latest IPCC reports, and we're overshooting 2.6 to we're at 4.5, heading to 8.5. What are
we're heading to 4.5. I think that's the best we may be able to do.
So can you just clarify for the audience exactly what those numbers are? What is that? Fahrenheit? Yeah. Is that Celsius? Is that something else?
Oh, okay. Those are. Yeah, I'm going to have to go back to the IPCC's terminology. Yeah, no, those are not in degrees. I do not. Yeah, those. Yeah, those represent different greenhouse scenarios for where greenhouse forcing will go to. I don't think those numbers correspond directly to the average global temperature. No, in fact, they do not. I'm sure. Sorry, I was up a little bit late, but so I don't remember offhand exactly what 2.0 means, but yeah. But just in terms of the overall trajectories and the way in which we will be able to bend the trajectories, because we do need to bend them, we're beyond being able to get to the 2.6, which is, I think that's the one that one keeps us in the relative safe zone of less than 2 degrees, which I don't exactly remember what that takes us to, but it is a regular, it is a relatively safe one, or it takes us to 2 degrees with a little bit of overshoot. I think all of them have some overshoot at the best. Yeah. So yeah, they don't correspond exactly to the average global temperature change. Yeah. No, it's a good clarification. Yeah, and I'm just not remembering right now exactly where those come from.
We have a real question?
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Comment. Yeah, Nick.
You showed the book written by Humboldt in the early 1820s on stratigraphy, the international stratigraphy. But I want to just say a little bit about its importance that I've worked on for my Buckland book. Because it underlines, it undergirds the point you've been making about Humboldt's significance. The thing is, in the first decade of the 19th century, there were big debates between leading geologists whether international stratigraphy was possible, whether stratigraphic sequences weren't local. And then Buckland and Cuvier and these people, Smith less, but these people established you could have a European stratigraphy. But whether it would be worldwide, which would have enormous consequences, of course, in thinking about the world, its history, climate, the effect of all these things, was not established. And it was Humboldt in that book, that's what he did. Not so much stratigraphy as such, but international correlation. And that is a great accomplishment, of course.
Yes.
And once again, undergirds the significance we are attributing to him in making people think in global terms, is in terms of temperature and the effect of that on rock sequences. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. In that he was. He recognized that you had rocks of, so it's an interesting contrast in his observations. He recognized that if you go from Europe to South America, you wind up with plants and animals that are just very different from what you would see. And that if you go up in elevation, you see changes in plants and animals and other kinds of things along with climate. But one of his observations that he pointed out in the essay on the geography of plants, and that I think is a major thing, it's what he unpacks, or one of the things that he unpacks in the 1823 Geology volume, is that you can find granite at any elevation, on any continent, at any latitude. And so that's not related to climate. And you can find limestone at any elevation and so forth. So that was part of what he was, an interesting problem that I don't think he was the first to recognize, but that he was trying to think through and resolve. And I think he had the insight, as you point out, of let's start looking at these intercontinental correlations of both in terms of their sequence in some sort of geological column, as well as in their spatial array, to try to sort them out. So, and I suspect that one of the reasons that he did not emphasize the history of life very much. There are just, I think, 2 or 3 paragraphs in Cosmos in volume 1, right at the very end, where he talks about this, is that again, when he wrote Essay on the Geography of Plants, this was all very new stuff. Cuvier was just publishing his work and so forth, but that there was no framework, stratigraphic or just a conceptual framework to hang a lot of this on, and I think Humboldt recognized that, and I think that was part of the motivation for the 1823 volume, to try to sort some of that out and develop a conceptual framework to put all that on. And then, and only then, could you get real paleontology and some kind of a narrative of the history of life. It's also very interesting to me that in the personal narrative, in virtually all of the work that he did coming out of the American voyages, that he's very agnostic about historical explanations in just explaining fundamental biogeographic patterns, like the fact that you had disjunct populations of Andean plants in the mountains above Caracas. And he opens the door for an historical explanation, which that's how we would explain it today. But then he slams it shut. He just says, I'm not going to go there because it's hypothetical or speculative. So I find that very interesting of why he wasn't a little bit bolder when he was so bold in so many other ways. But when it came to historical explanations, he was very conservative. And I'm guessing that it was because he felt we really didn't have that narrative framework of Earth history to be able to put a lot of this on.
So thank you, Stephen. Give a good hand again. Now, through this door.
Uh-oh.
Nice job.
Yeah, thanks.
And for those of you who were not here yesterday, joining the Stevens, Stephen Bell and Stephen Jackson, we have Nicholas Rupke at the end, Laura Walls, and Elizabeth Milan. They presented yesterday, so we welcome them back. We'll let you all get seated and settled in. I'm going to turn things over to today's moderator, Matthew Booker. He's going to introduce himself because I can't do him justice with my introduction.
I think the real question is why I get to be moderator. I'm an environmental historian, an agricultural historian, and an urban historian at NC State. The reason I get to be moderator is that Dan is a very generous person, and he's given me this pleasure. So it really is a wonderful thing to be at this symposium and to hear these experts. Our panelists have some questions for one another, and our goal this afternoon for the first portion is to have the panelists take on questions, raise questions that they have for one another, or I can impose them if you'd prefer, and also to answer a question that we got from the internet community yesterday. But before we get into that, I guess I would just like to say briefly that what this wonderful symposium has done is both, I think, to serve as a marvelous conversation between experts. We've seen, and we're about to see again, I think, the ways that the community of Humboldt scholars have spoken to one another in this symposium, and the ways that that conversation, as we heard yesterday, can enrich a continuing conversation about Humboldt amongst experts. But what I also find so impressive about this symposium is for persons like myself, and perhaps many of you in the audience, who are not experts on Humboldt himself, that it has served to do what Elizabeth said so beautifully yesterday, to do what you said was Humboldt's great goal, to awaken a pure love of nature in others, to remind us that science is participatory, and to give us inspiration in our own time to grapple with the problems that Steve addressed in his final talk. So I see this symposium as beautifully doing those two things, and it is my goal now for the panel to continue that conversation with y'all. So, panelists, would any of you like to raise a question yourselves, or do you want me to begin? Laura, please.
So I have a question. So, and this is directed towards this morning's papers in specific, but it has, I think, relevance for all of us. But I'm really struck this morning, whether by design or it's simply the way it happened, the way that the two presenters' papers spoke to each other so directly. So we have a portrait of Bonpland out in the field and frustrated because of all the kinds of barriers and gaps and miscommunications in politics, and he's trying also not just to do any old work, but to develop a particular kind, as Stephen was saying, a particular kind of field station type work, dense, rich, deeply grounded in specifics of a particular place. And the tension around that with the metropole, the kind of center of calculation with Humboldt in his study or his library. And I want to come back to that and just think more about it, just hear more of thoughts about that tension from the two of you, because then, Steve, you sort of stood up, and it was interesting because it was like I left the metropole and became a field scientist, and you were bringing us all of these images from the field and all this data from the field and saying, this is kind of the problem that you experience, and not just you, but climate science or earth system science, scientists more generally, that you're out there literally, getting your feet wet and getting dirty and getting, hands-on, and then coming into the urban environment and trying to say to people, but hey, this is real. I mean, look at these trees on this slope. They're dead. They're not supposed to be dead, or, all the other images that you have. Just would like to hear more about, either in Humboldtian terms, Humboldt and Bonpland, and just the way that, how does knowledge get communicated from the field to the metropole, and from the metropole back out to the field? And some part of that is not just communicated at an elite level, but also beyond, the bureaucrats and administrators, but to the people of the metropole and the people in the country. How do they get any part of any of this production of knowledge process, given the rifts and the difficulties that you've both outlined so well?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. That's a great question, and a really fundamental and, of course, difficult question. Yeah. I'll just a few comments. One is, we have just within disciplines, and within my own discipline of ecology, we have communications issues and cultural divides and tensions that run across the field depending on what you study, how you study it, whether you are doing place-based research or large global macroecological syntheses, whether you're doing rigorous experimental manipulations or doing more correlational, pattern studies. Those are two among many dimensions of variability within the field, and so within any discipline, I at least certainly I'll just speak for ecology. Within ecology and within most of the other disciplines that I'm generally familiar with in the earth and environmental sciences, there is a lot of diversity of perspective and approach. There are multiple cultures and subcultures, and a major challenge that's been out there since the development of science and the development of these disciplines has been communication, just within the subcultures, and getting people talking to each other. So that's a huge challenge just in the fundamental science, and that's always been with us. I think what is, and it's a challenge that hampers us in our ability to communicate with the rest of the world, in that we're also in a resource-limited environment, and each culture and subculture and subdiscipline and subdiscipline is, trying to get resources to, whether it's faculty members or grant funds or programs or whatever, to support their particular kind of work. So there's also that competition, which I think also hinders that communication and to some extent pollutes the communication with the outside, because we all think whatever we're doing is the most important thing. There's a little sidelight that I may come back around to, Kaplan's law of the instrument, that is basically the hammer law. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And Kaplan and I forgot, The Conduct of Inquiry, I think was the book. He talks about how to any particular science, to any particular scientist, the solution to a problem will correspond to the particular kind of tools and orientation that scientist is trained in. So if I'm an historical ecologist, so you throw a problem at me and I'm going to be saying, well, okay, from an historical perspective, here's what you need to know, and here's the obvious solution. But if I were an experimentalist, I would be approaching it very differently. So there's a big challenge. I think one of the biggest challenges, we also have cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary challenges. I think that's why these kinds of discussions are so valuable, because we can understand each other. For me, the really big, hairy one, and the one that's really part of my day job, is the cross-sectoral challenge, and that we have, on the one hand, in this particular instance, and where I work, we have a research community that's very engaged and wants desperately to help make things better. And we have a community of practice, the decision makers and managers in the federal agencies, the state agencies, the tribal agencies, the NGOs, and so forth. And they desperately want to make things better and preserve their resources. We actually all mostly come from the same cultures. They get the folks in the management sector, in the agencies, they have bachelor's and master's and PhD degrees from the Nicholas School and from the School of Natural Resources and Environment at Arizona. And they come from our academic world, and they come very frequently from the natural sciences or the social sciences, but they live in a completely different world now that they're in the agencies. They have, it's, what gets them promoted and what gets them fired is very different from what gets academics promoted or academics fired. And so even though you have these common origins, there's a huge gulf in communications, and that's a really difficult one, which was a real kind of a surprise to me of once I got into this, just how deep a divide that is. And I think that, again, the only way around that is a lot of dialogue and a lot of building a mutual understanding and trust, so that we can, those of us in the research sector, which I represent in this relationship, understand the world that the decision makers live in. And this applies not just to the managers, but if you're working with policy or the public or whatever, understand the world that they live in, what their interests are, and so forth. And at the same time, trying to communicate to them very clearly what our interests are. And sometimes it actually works very well when you get that kind of engagement, but it does require a lot of talking and, more important, a lot of listening. And I won't speak for others, but as a recovering academic, I can say that listening was not one of my strong suits coming into this, and that I've had to really learn from others and get some occasional occasional corrections, friendly corrections mostly, to get me to realize, okay, I'm not listening to this person, or I don't really, I need to hear that again to get that. And that's really critical, I think, in all of these cross-cultural communications, and is really inescapable when we're trying to take what we're doing in the research and scholarly communities and having real impact in those other worlds where we want to have impact.
I was very struck that Stephen dealt very much with creative tensions of past and present over a roughly 2-century period in his talk, so much of which focused on the science of now, or our time, with some sense of projection forward, but drawing very much an inspiration from Humboldt. We're talking about 2 centuries here, so my brain's turning to mush in terms of history of science. What threads can we use to sort of conduct some sense of where the most important changes lie? And as a geographer, I did talk a little bit in my presentation about the organization of spaces where work is conducted. The title of my book on Bonpland, part of the title, Life in Shadow, 99% of people who talk to me about that get obviously quickly in the shadow of Humboldt, but I meant it in other ways too, that in the shadow of a European educated person with excellent credentials coming out of Paris who chooses to live in the interior of South America. That's a kind of shadow in terms of institutional systems. But even matters of nature, Humboldt experienced lots of nature in a direct sense at various points in his life, above all in the American journey, but nowhere near as much as Bonpland did, who couldn't give it up. The tropics pulled him in, and the subtropics in particular. And when the orange trees are blooming in São Borja, Brazil, and the lemon trees on his rustic rural property, he's sitting in the shadow, and he cannot resist telling Humboldt how beautiful it is to live in this excellent climate. And I'm distressed about you sitting in Berlin in the winter around that white faience stove where it's sort of overheated and the windows aren't open, and so on. But organizational space, when Humboldt and Bonpland traveled, disciplines haven't really coalesced, it seems to me. But by the time their late careers are there, it's a very different story. So the norms do shift. I like to say to students at UCLA that some of the legacy of that tension in botany between field exploration, where you go out into the field and you collect something, the flower and the fruit, and you make the complete description. That's one thing, but then microscopy comes in by the 1820s or so, and then you can do lab-based work. I mean, Cuvier, for instance, he's pretty radical in a way at the Jardin des Plantes. He's knocking down walls and reorganizing space around his intellectual preoccupations and knocking away fields that no longer seem so dynamic. So you have this different ways of approaching, say, biology. So I say, we have 2 departments of biology at UCLA. Somebody kindly pointed out the other day, no, we have 6. So this specialization has continued and continued. One thing I haven't talked about, and I think it is important in terms of communication, is money. And it's worthwhile remembering, perhaps, that Humboldt's terribly inspired at a certain point by Sir Joseph Banks, who inherited staggering amounts of money as a young man, goes at his own expense with Cook into the Pacific and develops a scientific career of a certain sort. Sits in another center of calculation in London at the Royal Society. Humboldt, the Humboldt brothers are vastly wealthy people by the standards of their day. I love reading somewhere in the diaries where they're heading down to the south of France. Humboldt and Bonpland go gambling in a casino in a provincial French town, and Humboldt wins big. And as I remember, he gives the money back. I mean, this is a very different way of thinking from most of us. But Bonpland, who I have studied a fair amount, is somebody who was always in search of a patron all of his life. If it's not to be Humboldt directly, it's then the French state for a while, and that gets complicated because he can't do the paperwork smoothly to get that French state pension. and therefore is always looking around in southern South America for other patrons. And in a sense, loosely, the story of science and public policy, this matter of where the money's coming from, remains a very important one. And we have such unevenness in the conduct of scientific inquiry across the globe. I see myself as an Americanist. I mean, I was born in Britain. I have a Canadian citizenship. I've worked in Brazil and Argentina and on and on. I work in the United States. Even in this continent, the availability of research funds to do fundamental research varies dramatically, even in 2019 across the hemisphere. So I don't think I'm saying anything very coherent here, but I just do have this sense that we're dealing with a 2-century period with an enormous amount of history of science in an organizational sense and disciplinary sense to cover. I suppose, most compelling thing for me is that a colleague who works in contemporary science is so deeply inspired by Humboldt's work is marvelous.
Perhaps a few further observations on this significant topic of the spaces here, of the field, of course, exploration, and the space of the location where the collections are deposited and interpreted. While international exploration begins to flourish in the late 18th century and continues to do so in the 19th, at exactly the same time, you have the period of the founding of museums of natural history. And these are among the most important new architectural spaces in European capitals and in the capitals overseas. These are palaces of knowledge, and they are the storehouses of what is brought back from exploration. But they are also associated, and we already have talked a bit about that, these spaces with different levels of cultural authority. So while Humboldt is a bit of an exception, and so was Banks, most explorers indeed are paid employees who do the rough work, the dirty work. And it's not highly regarded to a certain extent. So great collectors, Blumenbach in Göttingen, who starts the Göttingen Academic Museum and has a famous collection in the late 18th century, he doesn't travel. He gets stuff sent to him. And in Paris, Cuvier doesn't travel. He gets it sent to him. And when Richard Owen in London founds and gets built for him the greatest palace of, natural history at that museum in South Kensington, he doesn't travel. He has the people to collect for him. And so that bridge, that tension in a way, gets removed in part by Humboldt because he interprets his own stuff and, of course, has somewhat of a noble background. Not very much, but to a certain extent. That helps, of course, him too, with authority, which Bonpland lacked. So just to underline further aspects, giving more detail to this notion of the different spaces that are involved. And yeah, I don't know to what extent we can see a continuation of that in the 20th century. I think it has changed somewhat. Of course, field work is by and large not frowned upon, on the contrary. But so there we have had a change in unification to a certain extent.
Laura just used the term, you just used the term bridge, Nicholas, and Laura used the term chasm or gulf yesterday. And there is a related question that we got from our interwebs audience yesterday that I wanted to raise with you now because I think you've approached it, several of you already. And that question had to do with this gulf between the arts and sciences that many people imagine and that you described, I think, very powerfully, Laura, in your talk, or at least you referenced it. So in addition to events like this one, our questioner asked, what that bring together people from many disciplines, what can we do to help bridge this gap? And in thinking about that, it's worth perhaps returning to Humboldt, who was a bestseller, at times at least, who imagined his audience, I think, in the way that Stephen Jay Gould might have imagined his audience sometimes, as well as for the foundational scientists. I just wondered if you all had further thoughts, perhaps you in particular, Laura, about that gulf between the arts and sciences that many of us perceive and some of us actually inhabit.
Well, of course, I've thought a lot about this, and it's sort of like, yeah, your response to my question, which is like, oh my God, you know, I don't even, I hardly know where to begin. I will say that the thread that's been throughout our 2 days together has been the role that aesthetics or art, perceptions, and passion, emotion play all through this. In other words, the separation that you do with hard science, whether it's in the field or in the laboratory or the museum collection, that there's a kind of hard surface, hard fact detachment. Is part of, I mean, even a museum display sort of creates that gulf, right? And it might be mediated through language, but it's usually, I mean, conventionally very dull language. So the public goes, and you watch where the kids go, and the kids are not reading the plaques, right? In fact, few people are reading all of that. So you've got aesthetics driving the I think even somebody like Cuvier had an aesthetics, right? But you have a kind of detachment as part of how we do things, which Humboldt resisted. And so he allows himself to write science from a position of passion, and he lets the emotion show. He tries to craft sentences that sort of carry a kind of poetic shape, a kind of dynamic movement to them that is not dry and kind of laying things out, but sort of carries you on a kind of voyage of discovery from even sentence to sentence that engages as language can do. And so there's no reason that science can't do this or a scientist can't do this, because the thought that somehow a scientist has to reduce, like I adore the work of the IPCC reports, but come on, they're unreadable. Absolutely unreadable, and it's tragedy. The most recent one, I sat down to try to read it because I wanted to know, well, how is this communicating to the public? This is such tremendously important information. And there's the gulf, there's the gap again, because it's just the driest, most deadly, most fact-ridden, most, occluded language. And there's no way I could hand that to my next door neighbor who's, sidling up to me and saying, yeah, it's gonna, it's a weird weather we're having, right? Can't have anything to do with, all that, stuff about climate change, right? There's an educational opportunity, but I cannot give them the IPCC report, and I sure can't tell them to watch the evening news because there's nothing on, the conglomerate news agencies. So it starts to become up to us to find the bridge building. Those of us who use words, and we all do that, historians, literary people, scientists, all of you. And so maybe it gets down to trying to be more bridge building in our attention, our sensitivity to the way that we use communicative acts to do more than build little hives of constituencies who sort of feed our egos or our competitive or money-driven, whatever, that we start thinking in terms of the action, the agency of our own statements in all the contexts in which we make statements, and how they can always reach beyond the most limited, narrow perception we have of, no, I'm only going to stay in this little box. And I wish the IPCC would hire a poet, a really good writer, not some news, agency type person, but I mean somebody who really gets it, to start communicating, maybe a flock of poets, to start writing the kinds of statements that could carry what they have found into the hearts of the minds and imaginations and understanding, intelligence of people who really do care. That would be amazing.
Yeah,
I think Elizabeth has a follow-up.
Just a quick addition to that, I mentioned this in some of the articles I do on Humboldt, but Humboldt quotes Goethe in his writing, complaining that the Germans have the talent for making science inaccessible to the public. So he was complaining about that many centuries ago, and you're bringing up the accessibility issue. And Humboldt, that was very explicitly on his mind, as we all know, when he wrote that he wanted science to be accessible to the public. And that is a talent that very few have, but it goes back to the listener's question, because unless we bridge that gap between, well, it's a different bridging, because some of the bridging I'm interested in is more than just a accessibility issue. It gets to deeper divides in the disciplines, but clearly there needs to be a bridge from all the scientific data that is so compelling to those who can understand it, and the neighbor you're describing who's saying, oh, it's warm, it's cold today, so much for climate change, you know. No, that's wrong, but you need somebody who's able to bridge that gap, and that's part of the problem we're having with people not caring about those dying trees. They see that and it's not connected to them, so who makes those connections? Someone like Humboldt did, and that's the relevance of Humboldt, is we still have so much to learn from him, and he did these things and we're still not doing these things, that is making science accessible to the public. So it's a good question.
A follow-up on that. It's more than one bridge. It's multiple bridges, because there are multiple audiences, and just I agree with everything you said, Laura, about IPCC reports. I do not enjoy reading them, particularly there, but they are targeted towards a very specific audience, and that is the international policy community, and they are adhering to very strict protocols. They're written by committee, and they are subject to votes of approval by not just the scientists, but also ultimately the government representatives in the room. So and that leads to, because because of their specific audience and the specific purpose for which they were developed, and because they're largely technical reports, I think that adds to the opacity. And you're going back to your question about what the numbers in the RCP mean. They don't really mean anything. I mean, they do mean something, but the translation from 8.5 or 4.0 to something tangible is not straightforward. They are representative concentration pathways that that do have some rough equivalent in terms of a particular trajectory that may stabilize at a particular temperature, but it represents an abandonment of their earlier use of, I think they started out with 2 times CO2 and 3 times CO2. That's fairly straightforward. Then they went to, in one of the later iterations, they went to global temperature estimates, and now they're getting more sophisticated because it's all becoming more complicated. They've got more sciences involved in there, and so it's becoming more and more esoteric and less transparent to the public. And so I let them off the hook a little bit for that. IPBES, actually, I was really disappointed in their global assessment, because it was it included a summary for it's addressed at policymakers, and yet there's really very little that a policymaker can do. I mean, it's a great scientific summary of what's going on, but if I were a mid-level or a senior manager in a in an agency concerned with biodiversity or ecosystem services, I wouldn't know where to start with that. And there's a process now underway to try to make that happen, but it was just partly a mismatch between the dominance. It was a mismatch between the group and the particular audience they were targeted at. So I think the paths to take are to figure out what are the audiences and what are their currencies and what's their level of understanding, and then develop any number of things. And I think IPCC and IPIS would probably say, well, it's not our job to do that. We sympathize and we'll help, but it's really up to other people to do that translation into these other kinds of products. And some people are doing that individually, and some governments are doing it, and so forth. But it is, as you say, a very large gap. The other thing, and I think you alluded to this, so not everybody can do this kind of translation, and not everybody can do interdisciplinary work. And if you don't have a talent for it, or if you can't develop the talent for it, which includes listening and communicating and so forth, then you shouldn't do it. You should just, we need people doing disciplinary stuff. But on the other hand, in my own view, if you can, you should, in these circumstances where it's of such vital importance that those who can do interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, to me, it's almost a duty to do it. And in the same way, these kinds of broader communications, if we can develop, if we have the skills or can develop the skills, I think we do have some obligation to apply them to these kinds of issues. And this is where I think this dialogue between the sciences and humanities has a lot of promise for taking us there, because we'll have a much better understanding of the different kinds of audiences and how to communicate effectively and how to engage effectively.
Okay, as moderator and thinking about audience, I'm going to do 3 quick things. First, I have a suggestion, then an observation, and then a redirection. The suggestion, so that we don't leave on the note of gloom about bad science communication, is that the National Climate Assessment, NC4, which came out, I think, last fall, was superb. Superbly written, easily accessible, excellent for teaching purposes, has targeted chapters that relate to each of the regions in the United States, and superb thematic chapters on questions like agriculture. Highly recommend NC4. It's available free online. Don't despair about the IPCC. We have the National Climate Assessment. I strongly recommend it. Secondly, an observation. Nicholas, you mentioned this, and I can't really let you take it further right now, but the power that Humboldt had in his visualizations, each of you really has shown how highly visual he was in his publications. Those visualizations are a bridge between the humanities and social sciences. They're a very powerful way that groups can communicate across and between, not just the 6 branches of biology that you mentioned at UCLA, for example, but between biologists and historians. Visualization, a very powerful tool, I think, for crossing those bridges. Now, the redirection. We have 16 minutes left or so, and I want to turn to our public audience, to our community here in this room, and ask you if you have questions for our panelists that you would like them to engage. Helga, please.
Yes, and I have 2 more examples. 2 more examples of attempts to communicate, in this case, to a young audience, I guess, teenagers. First of all, Andrea Wolf has made a comic of her book that is available in German and in English. And there is a group of German scientists, I think it comes out of climate science in Potsdam, and they have written a comic for young people. It's called The Great Transformation. It's in German, it's from 2013, and it has been translated into English. The English version is also available online. I happen to use the German version in one of my classes. So those are some positive comments, and of course they use visualization as a way to communicate to younger audiences. Then I have a question about the geography of plants. I guess mostly for Stephen Jackson. There is a lot of scientific data in there, and I was wondering how it is holding up in terms of accuracy and how useful it is for today's research, and also what may be the limitations or pitfalls for those kinds of comparisons, since there's also a lot of natural processes going on.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one of the things. So I'll give you a very specific answer and then generalize a little bit as well, and the generalization will take us back to Humboldt. So there has been a revisit to Chimborazo. Naya Moderator Holm, who is now at University of Copenhagen, as part of her dissertation a few years ago, she resurveyed Chimborazo, and actually I'm pleased to say that she was inspired to do that by our translation of the essay on the geography of plants. She read that, and she and her thesis advisor said, we need to go there and do this again. I still haven't forgiven her for not inviting me along to help with the field work, but I'm getting over that. But Naya's work shows that, that there has been upward displacement of snowline and some of the vegetation zones. It was published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, I think around 2013. I can get you the reference fairly easily. So yeah, things are changing, and they are being well documented. Again, there's some limitations in terms of just the overall precision, but they were able to get a lot of the original herbarium records and get those latitudinal and longitudinal and elevational coordinates from directly from Humboldt and Bonpland's notes. There are additional efforts that are being made along those lines using some of their other records in South America. And more broadly, this is part of these surveys, floristic and faunistic surveys that Humboldt really inspired, are now serving as platforms for their benchmarks that we can go back to and look at how things are changing on the landscape. So there's quite a bit of activity in ecology and biogeography of going and finding studies that were done in different places, from the Sierras to the northeastern mountains to the Alps and to Asia and so forth, and going back and revisiting elevational transects and latitudinal transects and just looking at biogeographic distributions. So that's, and we're finding a lot of change, and sometimes counterintuitive change. Some of what we're finding in the Sierras is that some species are moving down rather than up. And that's, there are good reasons for that. And again, that's I think that Humboldt's diligence in recording the geographic locations of those specimens that became the standard that was adopted and continues to be adopted. You look at 18th century herbarium records and they will say, Pomerania, or, it's very vague references. And since his time, they tend to be much more precise. And now those kinds of records are being used. The herbarium director at University of Wyoming died a couple of years ago, but I used to tell him that he never published papers. He just had students going out doing floristic surveys of the Rockies and compiling lists and depositing their materials in their herbarium. I used to tell him that, Ron, people will be singing your praises 100 years from now, long after I and all the other people in this department are long forgotten, because they're establishing that baseline that we will continue to need.
Are there other members of the audience who haven't had a chance to ask a question yet? Yes, Kathleen.
Thank you. So this was a fascinating morning, and I found the juxtaposition of Bonpland and Humboldt to really give a very nice contrast between one scientist who was very, very mobile and able to travel and cover much of the globe, and one who was literally confined to one space for years on end. And you mentioned three very different kinds of science that was going on at that time. One in which people were studying museum collections, pretty much disassociated from location. Then people like Humboldt, who were the ones collecting and interpreting the collections in terms of where they came from, so geography entered. And then Bonpland, who was perhaps not able to cover the space that other people were for the collections, but did have the benefit of looking at how one particular location, to look in depth of that, look at the variation of organisms within that, to look at the interaction between the birds and the plants. So a very different spatial scale. And it made me wonder to what extent just this difference in mobility and contrast of a sort of local observation versus a global scale, on the one hand, made me think of two things. So first, to what extent can somebody clarify was Bonpland's disappointment and his and challenges perhaps a function of the fact that the currency of science at that time seems really to be in collections and the novelty of collections as museums were being built, such that more than, or many, many samples of the same thing might not have been looked upon with much value. So that his confinement, his spatial confinement, was really not in line with what people were most excited about in terms of just looking at the sheer biodiversity across the globe. And then I guess the other question is, the geography of plants was really a co-authored endeavor, it seems like. And I wonder how much insight in terms of some of the changes that Alexander von Humboldt was referring to in terms of the drying of the lake really had to be provided by somebody who had a perspective of change over time of one location. I found it very interesting that that was a co-authored publication that was, what you said, a sort of summary of the cosmos. And it seems like some of those insights, I'm very curious what you might think of were really provided by Bonpland's perspective of living in one location for long periods of time.
Perhaps I've sown some misconceptions along the way. Probably Bonpland saw more of the Americas than any individual in the 19th century. I mean, he was present on the entire journey with Humboldt, and then he spent a lot of time in southern South America. And while this is a regional type of study that's confined to one part of the Americas, it's nevertheless a pretty large area. We're talking about from Buenos Aires up to Paraguay, about 1,000 miles, and not much less from there to the Atlantic Ocean if you go due east. It's very important, I think, to look at these emerging botanical publications on the Humboldt-Bonpland journey, the works of Walter Lack out of Berlin, the work of Fred Stauffer out of Geneva. If we're going to talk about using this material from the Andes as some sort of baseline, if we go into the botanical manuscripts, 4/5 of the work minimum is in the hand of Bonpland. So it's really Bonpland's work there in a botanical sense that provides the baseline, it seems to me. But this matter of exposure to material is a very important one. Is it fleeting? Are you going through once, quickly? Are you getting it right? Bonpland became a trenchant critic of many of his contemporaries who published their work. He writes withering stuff on, say, Saint-Hilaire. He says, what Mr. Saint-Hilaire says about the cultivation of cotton in French is of absolutely no importance. And he's basing that on empirical observation. He would record how things were grown in certain parts of South America and then strike a line through it. This fascinates me because travel observation becomes, for historical disciplines, very much a baseline. And we don't always use it very critically. We say, wonderful, we got some recording of society, economy, land use patterns in a particular part of the Americas. But we need to be very careful that sometimes with pressures of time and need to get things out in print, something that all academics feel in 2019 still, perhaps even more, we sometimes get things wrong in our haste. It doesn't mean to say that we can always sit back and give ourselves infinite time to study phenomena. There have to be limits, but there are challenges that come from limited exposure in time and space. I know there are other components to your questions, and I want other people to talk to them.
I'd like to say one thing about your aspect of your question, and that your comment about Lake Valencia and his Humboldt's work there raises an issue that we really haven't talked about much, which is, so why does it take 5 years to go from place to place? It's not that he, and this is implicit in what Stephen just said, it's not that he shot through or the two of them shot through an area, just grabbed stuff and ran, oh goody, more stuff out there, let's go and let's keep going. They would sit down for months and at least once as long as a year, in one place. And then they would take little side excursions. They talked to people everywhere, and personal narrative is riddled with Humboldt recording conversations, bits of conversations with all kinds of people, including his native guides, the monk that they were traveling with, people at whose homes they stayed, people who came up and badgered them when they were collecting or taking measurements. And so much of what you get from the texture, especially in the personal narrative, but it's everywhere, is that things like the observations on Lake Valencia were partly that they're digging into historical records. They're talking to people. They're observing the land. They're going out and talking to whoever's farming the land, to laborers. They're talking to indigenous people about, what are their lives? What are their memories? How do you communicate? Who are your nearest neighbors? Who are the people who live next to you? What materials do you use? How do you use them? What do you call these things? And all of this is distilled into these reports. So it's vastly richer than just grabbing a little, object or thing and then stuffing it into a museum somewhere. Maybe somebody grabs a lot of things at a museum in Paris and says, oh, okay, here's a lot of things. How do we categorize them? And that's part of where all of this dynamism comes from, because, how do you get lots and lots of reports from lots and lots of people into your head to try to figure out what are the big patterns? And so there's a macro, sort of cosmic level to finding the big patterns, but it always grows out of these, just tens of thousands of moments of conversation and observation and digging into historical records, dusting off archives. Some of these records are hundreds of years old in the Spanish Empire. And then trying to get a temporal line of historical change along with contemporary accounts. And a lot of these people died in the revolution too. So it's a kind of mournful, they weren't there for follow-up questions, because politics tore this landscape apart and threw the people off the land. And so there's a kind of loss of knowledge, of local knowledge, and that's really what we're talking about there.
Yeah, I'll just add that part of Humboldt's genius was his ability to navigate across these massive scale changes from global to local. And so he understood the importance of place-based knowledge, as Laura just articulated, and absorb that kind of information by any means he could, whether through direct conversation, correspondence, extensive reading, and so forth. So he recognized that you needed the site-specific and often spatially precise details, and you needed to be able to put them together in a broad framework to look at the larger regional and continental and global patterns, and then some of these generalizations and mechanisms would emerge. And I think that's where he just, for me, intellectually just jumps way out ahead of his contemporaries in just being able to work conceptually and to work effectively across such a broad range of scales.
What? Yes, please. You 1 minute.
Quick,
1 minute.
Okay, 60, 50. Now, also, it just goes back, I think that detail is, given that strong, which I mentioned yesterday, Eurocentrism of the period, the fact that when he is going there, he's talking to all the local people shows his deep respect for the people there. He didn't have this sort of arrogance that I'm the besserwisser, the one who knows it all, and I'm here to teach you about your territory. He was also learning from the local people, which is something a lot of, I think even scientists today don't always do. And so this kind of democratic approach to knowledge acquisition is something I think we've lost a little bit, and that's part of why we have some of the gulfs that we do have today. So again, back to learning from Humboldt about respect for the people that you're working with and whose land was settled by them, who were there before he discovered them, and he never speaks of discovery, thankfully. Okay, my minute's probably up.
Elizabeth, I'm so glad you had that last comment because it's such a fitting end. Wonderful answers to wonderful questions. There are more, I know, out there, but we're out of time, and I want to give Dan Richter, our leader, the last chance to say something. But first, thanks to our panelists. Thank you to our panelists who have welcomed us back into Humboldt and reminded us that he doesn't belong to anyone but to all of us. Thanks to the Forest History Society, represented here by Jamie Lewis in the flesh, for hosting this wonderful event. It was a really terrific opportunity. And because he's not going to take any credit himself, I really want us to have a chance to thank Dan Richter for his inspiration and leadership in this process. Thank you, Dan.
12:01. We did it. Yeah. Thank you all. I like these other words of conclusion. They were better than anything I could have prepared. I really appreciated each and every one of you guys. Such diverse people and so united. Thank you all.